Hello, welcome to yet another coffee break with Kardec. Let's have our coffee or our tea. It's up to each one. And while we have our coffee or tea, let's talk about material and spiritual sciences, according to the book Genesis by Allan Kardec. Kardec is very clear when he presents the book in his introduction. When he talks about sciences or science, he tells us that science, the objects of science, is the study of laws of the material principle. So we study the laws in the material, the physical world, and this is the object of science. And Spiritism, the object is the knowledge of the laws of the spiritual principle. What we see from what the spirits brought to us and what Kardec has compiled, and especially in this book Genesis, is that we are under the same laws, same general universal laws. But these laws, they have some emphasis depending on the level of the materiality as such of the world where we are. We know that matter exists in all forms, in the physical world and in the spiritual world, by what we've been told by the spirits. And the laws behind that, coordinating all the work, is the same. I'll give you an example, for instance. When in science we study the micro world, the world of atoms, for instance, and we study the macro world, the world of planets, of galaxies, stars, and so on, we are under the same laws, the very same laws, the laws that are described in physics. But the laws that are going to govern those phenomena, those particular phenomena, are just some among all the laws that exist. For instance, when we study the atom, the electromagnetic forces are the ones that are used to understand that particular phenomenon. When we move to the universe and we start to study the universal, the celestial bodies, we have to use gravitational forces. What does it mean? That in the atom, there's no gravitational forces, and when we look at the celestial bodies, there's no electromagnetic forces. No, it's just that the predominant force within the micro level is the electromagnetic, also the atomic forces, which are very particular atomic forces to the atom. And when we look at the celestial bodies and try to explain the movement of planets around the stars and the natural satellites like our moon around our planets, we don't need to use electromagnetic forces because they are not important. The important ones, the ones that govern the phenomena at that level, are gravitational forces. So the same happens between the physical and the spiritual world. The universal laws, they are the same. They govern the universe since the very principle of this universe. But depending on the circumstances, in this case, we are in a very dense physical world, whereas in the spiritual world, matter is not that dense. So the laws governing everything, they are the same. But the ones that predominate amongst all those laws are certain laws. And then in the physical world, certain laws predominate because they are the ones governing dense bodies. Whereas in the spiritual world, the predominant ones are other laws, but they are all part of the same, I would say, same box of laws that we have in the universe, the universal laws, universal natural laws. So Kardec says that the spiritual forces and the material forces, or the material principle, or matter as we know it, they react upon each other both ways, because they are under the same laws, although some predominate in one, some others predominate in another. It's the same when we study the atom and we study a galaxy, for instance. The electromagnetic forces are there. They are present in some phenomena, even at that level of galaxies. But the predominant, the one that makes that movement of all the celestial bodies, and I used to predict those movements to understand them, are the gravitational ones. They are relevant for that. So it's the same regarding the atom. The electron, the protons, the neutrons, they all have mass. If they have mass, they have gravitational forces around them, like a gravitational field. And then they have gravitational forces existing there. But they are so weak compared to other stronger forces, the nuclear one, the weak and the strong, and the electromagnetic. They can be left aside and not be taken into consideration. So this is more or less what Kardec tries to bring to us into the context before we actually dive into Genesis to understand the explanation for what has been considered miraculous so far. Why is that? Because we use our senses still very much. So the first objects of our studies as human beings were those that impressed very much our senses. So we started with astronomy because at night, with the beautiful sky without electricity at that time, maybe just a bonfire or, so very little light at night. We could see clear night sky, beautiful one. So that appealed very much to us humans. And then we started to study the sky. And actually, a proper study of the skies as such, started about 500 years ago. We can date it back. I mean, we had the Greeks, and the Greeks were about 4-5 centuries before Christ, but they had just some insights here and there. And the more structured knowledge, we started actually to have it from the 15th, 1600 onwards. And we had Kepler, we had Galileo, Tycho Brahe. Those were the first ones actually to register the sky and try to find an explanation for the movement of the celestial bodies. And it's interesting because there was a transition at that time. Before, they used naked eyes to study the night sky. And then from Kepler and then Galileo, they started to use instruments. And it's interesting that some people considered it very intrusive to look into the sky with instruments. You would see it in greater detail, as if you were going to inside someone's house and started to look inside the wardrobe and whatever, go into the kitchen and open all the cupboards as such. So it was very intrusive for some people to see how they used to think at that time. You are back actually intruding into God's house, sky. But then we made some improvement, and because of astronomy, we moved into physics. And then from physics, we had to move into chemistry. And so why was that? Actually, we were trying to study even in even greater detail the world around us and beyond our senses. Although sometimes it's very difficult for us to detach ourselves from our senses to what makes sense to our five senses and understand something that is different, is in a different domain. So Kardec puts that all the sciences, they are linked. Starting with our sciences here, as I said before, the material sciences, because they first strike our senses. But as we progress, we create new theories, new instruments, we start to look into greater detail, we elaborate theories, and then we test these theories. And we then have a different understanding of the world around us. And we've moved so much. We've had, let's say, 500 years at the most, and the greater progress we've made in the past couple of centuries. But we are still at the very beginning, and our understanding of the world around us has changed so much. And now we have, for instance, in our sciences, we have anatomy, physiology in greater detail. Only recently, we've managed to understand a tiny fraction of the way our brain works, and biology, and then geology. Geology was a new science at Kardec's time, and there was, let's say, less than 200 years ago, 170, 160 years ago, when he started publishing first the Spirit's book and then the other books that compose the Spiritism. And the thing is, as we move forward, our understanding changes. Initially, it was just we could understand from our senses, what I see, what I hear, what I feel, the pressure I feel. We know the air is there. Why? Why do we know there is air around us? Because of the winds. We feel the blow of the wind because we see a tree moving. But in a day where we have no winds whatsoever, where everything is very still, it's difficult for us to use our senses to perceive the air around us. And it's interesting. But now we've moved further away from our senses in trying to understand it. That's why then came the time for the spirits. They had to wait for us to get to this point, detach ourselves to a certain extent from our senses to understand the world around us. And then they come and present an extension of this world, or actually, what is beyond. We are like a tiny island, and they came to explain the ocean around this island. And then the continents, they exist further afield. So as our understanding starts to, move further and further away from these first impressions we had from our senses, we then start to create conditions for us humans to understand what means life in the spiritual world, for instance, and how the spiritual world and the physical world, they interact all the time. And one point that Kardec raises there is matter is inert. How are we going to explain life, thought, feelings? We still don't explain that. Sometimes we take things for granted. We pretend the answer is there, and then we move a step further and say, okay, it's there, so how can we deal with that? And we deal to a certain extent in a limited way because we need to understand even better. And the spirits, what they came to do was exactly when our sciences were developing, they came to give us information to sort of guide us towards this development, to show that what was considered miraculous, because the two worlds, spiritual and material, are interacting all the time. But sometimes we don't have a material explanation for the phenomenon. So we either ignore it or we classify it as something mystical or something magical or whatever. So because we don't have an explanation for that. And some people, because they can't explain that, they just consider that not to exist and say, well, if I can't explain with my method of research, it doesn't exist. No, it doesn't work that way. And to that, there's a very interesting interview with a German medical doctor. I watched it on YouTube this week, Dr. Oliver Lazar, where he had no preconceived idea. He didn't believe in spiritual world, or he wasn't even concerned with that, actually. He was just a medical doctor, received all the information from his school and then the medical school. And then all of a sudden, he found himself experiencing something very strong that he couldn't explain with all the knowledge that he had. He tried to find an explanation within that, he couldn't. Then he started to move into a different realm. And it's very interesting. Then Dr. Lazar, after applying his academic methodology, the methodology he used to apply in his projects, his research in the medical field, he used the same one. And he came to the conclusion that our conscience is not in our physical body. It is beyond. And then it's very interesting, the results of this research that he's done. He says, I'm still a medical doctor. I've applied the same methodology to study something that was new to me. I had no explanation. And then I found that the spirit survives, and all that the spirits came to tell us in the Spirit's book. He, through a different way, he got to the very same conclusions. So just to show that material and spiritual elements, they are combined and they are indissoluble. They are part of the very same world, a very broad world that our senses don't allow us to see directly, but through certain phenomena considered to be a spiritual phenomena, mediumship, we can study them, we can interact with them. So that's what I had for today. Finished my coffee. So I hope to see you all next time. So see you in the next Kardec coffee break with Kardec. Bye bye.